to Emily Franklin Clark for that great rendition of I Am Beautiful, which we will be coming back to later in our talk. But keep those lyrics in mind, because we'll be expanding upon them a little bit later on. Before we start, thanks, enormous thanks are due to Emma Saperstein. Who is the curator of the Miossi Gallery here at Cuesta, who invited us to come and make this show. And we've known Emma for more than 4 years. She has become a very trusted and wonderful colleague and supporter of our work. And we really appreciate the fact that you brought us back here now 3 times. Carry on, Mr. Wilson.
Hello. Is this working sufficiently? How are you? We're somewhat bedraggled, as this morning we set off from Morro Bay, as you can see, to bring 24 roses, precisely the distance from the coastline to the gallery.
On foot.
Good point. So what we'd like to do is share with you some of our historical work, and we'll try not to make it too long. And if anyone has a question at any point, or a request for clarification, we can interrupt. So, in Chicago, we found ourselves one day doing the kind of passive research that we're well known for by wandering around in a costume store. And we noticed these 2 costumes for rent. One was called Old God, and the other one, Young God. Just for a moment, reflect on the theological implications of a younger God. Anyway, we were asked to be part of a performance festival, and we did this piece. It's called Young God and Old God Play Table Foosball First to 100.
No, it's actually called Match of the Day 2.
Sorry.
Subtitled.
Yeah, I got the subtitle. Anyway, so as you can see, this is in late April, nearly May in Chicago. So the weather produced some of the highest waves ever seen on Lake Michigan that day. In this image, which was about the only one that was able to be taken before we were nearly swept off the pier and to our certain deaths. Greg Stimac, who was our photographer at that time, luckily had no regard for our safety, and so just kept urging us to move further and further back so he could get the shot right. At which point we were knocked off our feet by this wave. I'm at the back, so I didn't even see it coming. My beard swung around, my wig flew off, and the last thing that I could remember was watching Adam, for some reason, holding on to the foosball table instead of saving himself. Remarkably.
It was my son's, so there's a very good explanation.
Oh, I didn't know that. Anyway, not only did he save the table, as he flew past me horizontally, dressed as Old God, but also caught the ball with his other hand. While I was busy being impressed, I was nearly drowned.
There's an interesting aside to this piece. It is an absolutely straight photograph that Greg Stemach took, but Stanford University, for reasons that we still are not quite sure about, used this image in an online Photoshop class to show what is possible with Photoshop. Without consulting us, we were doing a search for past images a few years ago, and this came up, and they said, yes, master the skills of Photoshop and you too can make wonderful images like this.
Charles Saatchi also stole it for his online
Gallery.
Without permission. It's also appeared in a variety of other ways that were quite surprising. There's some kind of faith-based website, I can't remember the name of it, but it also uses this image.
So basically, someone in a Photoshop class was trying to use that as an example, and you did not Photoshop that.
Right.
That's
Yeah,
that's like almost disrespectful, but at the same time, it's kind of a compliment because it's like that's
Sure.
how good it is.
Oh.
Because it looks like it could have been Photoshop, but it really wasn't. It was a real photo without any sort of edit. But it's really awesome.
Right. Thank
Yeah.
you. That's what. Well, that's not what we thought. We told them that they were idiots.
So you should talk to Greg and tell him what a consummate photographer he is.
Because he is. All right. So, any of you budding performance artists out there, if you need any career advice, get arrested. It's the quickest way to get your name out there, and everybody finds it the most extraordinary thing. Particularly the police that arrested me on this occasion for doing what you can see here. I'm drawing a line with a Crayola down State Street. Now, I've done a lot of really stupid things in my life where I was convinced I was going to get arrested. This wasn't the one that I anticipated. That's not the arresting officer, I think that's a traffic warden. Anyway, I was suddenly aware that there were 4 or 5 squad cars with lights flashing all around me, and we had done this at the end of one of my drawing classes, so my entire drawing class had come out to witness this. I told them it would be very, very boring, but they did it anyway to get out of drawing class. So they witnessed their professor get arrested. And as a consequence, I was very popular that semester. There's a very long story behind this because I eventually go to the station and I get interviewed for a couple of hours, which descends into a lecture about the history of performance art to about 8 police officers. But my particular memory of it and my further understanding of who I work with, because just as they were arresting me, and they seemed very angry, you know, for some reason, they turned to Adam and said, "Are you anything to do with this?" To which he replied, and I quote, "I'm just taking photographs."
Which, to be fair, I was, because someone needed to document this.
It's the use of the word "just" in that sentence.
It also should be pointed out that if you're part of a collaborative team and one of you gets arrested, the other needs to be still at liberty in order to potentially stump up the bail money. It should further be pointed out that this was the first instance of many in which I have rescued my working partner from the clutches of not only the law, but virtually every other institutional and personal structure you can imagine.
Okay, got me back there.
So the piece was called Line in the Sand. Did you mention that?
Yeah, back in 2004, we had Bush, George W. Bush, you know, the whole thing setting off in
Iraq.
And I kept hearing this phrase, line in the sand. What's the line in the sand, right? So it's sort of cliche, and then you keep hearing it everywhere. So this was our completely pointless line in the sand. This is down State Street, which is 0 in Chicago on the grid system. So it divides East and West America for one block. Utterly pointless, for which I got arrested.
One interesting thing that you may not quite be able to see from this image is that in the upper right you can see the line, and at the end of the line, at the top of that photograph, you can just about see someone wearing a yellow jacket. That person is actually on a bicycle, and it's a bicycle-mounted policeman who followed the line directly to Matt and said, "Are you responsible for this?" He was there because the merchants on State Street didn't like the fact that there were 2 performance artists outside their businesses disrupting, so they thought, the flow of commerce.
And that's the one thing you can't do in America. Disrupt the flow of commerce.
So go to our website if you're interested in reading the entire account of this, which is really hilarious. Ending up with these 8 cops asking Matt what kind of beer he liked, and of course he said Guinness, and he was an instant hero in the police station.
Because they were all Irish. So there's a slight change of tone in this piece. These are 3 works where we've created our own paper out of 3 works of literature. So they're about 18 inches wide, I think, and then the
22 inches wide, about 14 inches high.
And then the hand-drawn bills are in pencil. The top one, the $1 bill, is the Bible. The $10 bill is the 9/11 Commission report, and the 100 is the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. And the piece invites a reflection on the possible through line between those 3 works. Yes.
Did you buy those from a publisher, or did you print those off of
We made them.
We bought the books.
No, so they were made from books, right?
Made from books.
Yeah, so
So we
each
bought the
one
books.
is the paper of one entire book.
So they're the publisher that published the 9/11 report?
No, we just bought a copy of the 9/11 Commission report.
That's fine.
And threw it into a vat, and it got pulped.
Well, I actually did it in the kitchen.
Did you use covers too?
No, we had to take those off. And I've just got to say that pulping a Bible in a blender in your kitchen gives you pause. You know, is this perhaps the worst thing that I could possibly do? Certainly in the kitchen.
So this is one of a number of connected works, all called Epilation, which means to remove hair. And my mother, after she died, had a number of quite amazing 60s clothes, including this fur coat, that my father decided should be left potentially to my wife, who is sitting here, who rarely comes to these talks. But because it was styled in 60s fashion, it was really strange looking, and so it hung in the cupboard for a number of years. But when we were thinking about making a new work and thinking about what we might use as the defining prop of this work, this coat immediately came to mind. And so each time we made this work, and the first time we made it was for a benefit for the Hyde Park Art Center in Chicago, which any institutional benefit is always going to be full of people who have lots of money, and if it's wintertime, they will undoubtedly, some of them, be wearing their fur coats. So we riffed off that and decided that we would be the technicians, and each time we made this work, we asked a model to be the one who was the focal point of the work, and we told each one of these models to go where they wished, which got us into some trouble, not in this piece necessarily.
Well, it was nearly a ride in this piece.
Well, yeah. And so the focus of these multiple epilation pieces was not on us. We were just the ones shearing the coats in wearing our lab coats. This was actually at the first night of a performance space in Chicago called Defibrillator, which is one of the very few pure performance-based exhibition spaces in the city. And Joseph Ravens, who founded and runs this space, invited us to come in with a number of other performance artists, including this Estonian performance troupe who you see us surrounded by, who take the anarchic approach to performance. So they had flamethrowers, it was snowing outside, they brought in big chunks of icy snow. At one point, one of them came over to Matt with a plunger and stuck it on the back of his head. They did everything that they possibly could to disrupt us because they felt that we were not being sufficiently reverential and acknowledging of their work. And it's interesting to be in the space with other performance artists all trying to make the biggest impression. So what we decided very rapidly was that we were not going to be thrown up our stride at all. In fact, we were going to ignore everything that they tried to do. And we created this kind of bubble of calm around ourselves. Our model just moved through the space. Everything that they tried to do to disrupt us was unsuccessful, and in the end they just gave up, and we essentially owned that space.
Well, it wasn't a plunger, by the way. It was a vacuum cleaner.
Oh, it's a vacuum cleaner, yeah.
It kind of stuck it to the top of my head. Yeah, they're called, what are they called? Non grata. They make the worst performance that you'll ever see in Estonia.
But seem to have done quite well despite that. Because they're from Estonia, maybe. I hope there's no Estonians in the audience.
They're all Estonians.
Shit.
Okay, so this is 10. We've done this piece on several occasions. It's a block of ice sculpted into the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments in this instance as an object is actually modeled after the Ten Commandments from the film, called The 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston. So we had an ice sculptor sculpt the 10 Commandments. He said that the commission stopped him drinking because he was so moved by it, which is good news. So we wanted to recommission him to do it a couple of years later. And so I called him on his cell phone, and he told me he was up a mountain in New York and had recently lost his small toe. So we were unable to bring him back. These days we use only a laser cutter.
The reason that he lost his small toe was that he moved his ice sculpting business to upstate New York, and strangely his business caught on fire, his ice sculpting business, and in an attempt to try and extinguish it, he lost his little toe.
We know a lot of people like this. Anyway, so we wheeled the 10 Commandments. As you can see, there is a tap in the top, and we had glass bottles with the word faith sandblasted on the side of them. And so the water, as it melted, we gifted to members of the public. And we went from the Museum of Contemporary Art, which is, for those of you who've been to Chicago, is on Michigan Avenue, and so is the Art Institute. So we walked between those two art establishments.
And the thing that kind of amazed us was that everyone took this pretty much at face value. We had 144 bottles, and people were so eager to take these, including policemen and everyone on the street. Only one person asked us if we were, if we had sacrilegious intent, which we really didn't answer.
What was the significance of 144?
It was the number of spaces that was in a box that we used that was Matt's grandfather's. So it was the space that existed in this. It was 12 by 12. We created compartments inside that box.
We've recently, before we get to this one, because you're not going to like us after that one, we recently redid 10. What was it? It was a week after or a day after?
2 weeks after.
Trump was elected, and so we delivered the 10 Commandments to Trump Tower in Chicago.
And left it on the steps to melt away. Not that he's really ever thought about the 10 Commandments.
Moving on. So we got into trouble with a lot of people over this piece. And I've always thought that it was one of the rare occasions when we did something that actually had a moral compass. And yet, despite that fact, or at least my belief in that, in the fact that it had a moral compass, it really upset a lot of people. Now, you can see here that we put out an ad on Craigslist for anyone who's engaged in an affair. And back then, Craigslist was the sort of Wild West. It's been cleaned up a bit since. But we, as you can see, any couple, any age, any race, any gender, all we wanted to find was somebody who was definitely engaged in an illicit love affair. And then we would put them up in a hotel, supply roses and chocolate and the usual things, and we would want only a photograph of them, which we would offer to obscure their features with or on in any way that they deemed appropriate. So they decided how to obscure their own features. We did, in the build-up to this, have a lot of really weird conversations with people from all over America who were either understanding what we were trying to do but not engaged in an affair, or they thought that maybe we could set them up. So this is the photograph that we got of the couple that we eventually worked with. Now the animal masks were brought by them. This photograph was chosen because, if you can make it out, the one note of any kind of passion, connection, or intimacy to us was her little finger. And as you can see, we spared no expense on the hotel room. Now, to me, this image is tragic. You know, I mean, we're industry of the ordinary. We deal with ordinary things, and infidelity and lying are ordinary things, unfortunately. We are not, perhaps you'll agree, in this image celebrating infidelity. But that was the way that, for some people, it came across. And that we were saying, not only is it ordinary and common, but it was also a good thing and something to find humour in. So I don't find that image very hospitable at all.
So one of the things that first connected the two of us was our love of football, the real football, not throw ball, as football is actually should be called in this country, but football, soccer. And
you're losing the audience.
Say that again?
Just try and keep them on our side.
Yeah. So the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago asked us to do a piece on the forecourt of the museum, which for those of you that know the museum has these series of steps and then a big granite open expanse. And so we were interested in thinking about, talking about the origins of football, which according to one account, the Aztecs invented, and they used the heads of their enemies that they had cut off during battle and kicked these heads around. So we decided that we would take that account and make our own heads cast in industrial rubber, and they would simultaneously be used as footballs in a game for anyone that wanted to play. So I'm still not quite sure if that's my head or Matt's head.
That's my head.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
All right, it's Matt's head being booted around.
I know it's my head because that kid is a former student of mine. And he took supreme pleasure in kicking my head around.
That kid actually is Jesus, who was the original instigator of the Jesus Project. So the coda to this piece was, it was raining, as you can see, but there are a lot of people who were very enthusiastic about getting involved in this. These heads were really heavy and they bounced really high. One participant actually suffered a mild concussion when it whacked her in the head. But it was mayhem on the forecourt here, and in the middle of this ad hoc football match, the Chicago Police Department pulled up, and the curator who had invited us went over and talked to them, and then they went away after she'd explained what was going on. But she told us afterwards that there had been a report phoned in to the Chicago Police Department that there was a battery in progress in front of the Museum of Contemporary Art. So
It's the only time the police have ever been called to the MCA.
So it's another badge that we wear with honor.
So this is a project which is kind of complex, and we'll give you only a brief description of it. But we were commissioned by the Nebraska History.
State Historical Society.
Yeah. And so we spent 3 months traveling around Nebraska, studying and learning as much as is possible to learn in 3 months about the state, interviewing people, and trying to create this mural that wraps around this rotunda here, using images, color, and other information that we gleaned from that 3-month experience. And I'd never been to Nebraska when we got this commission, and I thought, well, Nebraska doesn't seem that very interesting to me, because I'd only driven across that, what is it, I-80, right? It's just flat. But it was an extraordinary experience. Nebraska is, as you might expect, much more varied than someone like me would be led to expect, perhaps. And what else do we want to say about this one?
So just from a structural, formal standpoint, this used to be the headquarters of the Nebraska State Historical Society, and so those are all curved glass panels that house behind them a diorama of the history of Nebraska. They moved their headquarters probably 15 years before we were commissioned further down towards the state capitol, but because this was a historically significant building, they needed to use this space. And they were renovating it, so this became a Percent for Art commission. But the brief was that we use these glass panels in some way. So essentially, we divided each one, or we took each one of the 12 panels and assigned it a subject or a category that we divined from all of the research that we did. So we looked at the history, we looked at the topography, we looked at what significant events had taken place, what people had lived in Nebraska. So, for example, you can see that, and then on this inner curve is engraved each one of those categories. Most people don't know that Malcolm X was born in Nebraska, and so we made one panel that featured a quote by him. This detail is the category order. A lot of people didn't know that the Enola Gay was built in Nebraska, so we used the insignia that was on the side of the Enola Gay as it flew across the Pacific to drop the first nuclear bomb on Japan, and juxtapose that with a symbol that we found in the middle of the state, which is a Native American symbol for the universe or the infinite. So what we were really trying to do was to draw all of the disparate and diverse sources that we found through these multiple conversations that we had and create something that was structured and talked about the multiple layers of this state's history, which, as Matt said, are always going to be more interesting than one might imagine. So this phrase, "I want to be ordinary," has become kind of unofficial mantra. So we started using it a few years ago, printing it on brown paper bags, which of course are about the most ordinary packaging and carrying form that you can imagine. And we sent these to people around the world in exchange for them sending us a picture of them using it. So the two images at the bottom on the left is Paris and on the right is Athens. We got some really strange and indecipherable images back. And then we used it on billboards. And then in conjunction with our show at the Chicago Cultural Center a few years ago, this is the Hyde Park Arts Center. They have a video projection facade. So we translated that phrase, "open to be ordinary," on Google Translate into the 57 languages that were then available, some of which we found out later were complete gobbledygook, which was also interesting to us, that Google Translate, of course, is going to be fully fallible. And then in conjunction with that, we created these banners for the facade of the Chicago Cultural Center. It took us about 8 months to convince the city and the bureaucracy that, because no one had ever hung anything on the front of the Cultural Center before. It's a landmark building. And so we had to devise a system that didn't drill into the facade, but wrapped around the side. And so now, for every show, they use this system that we essentially implemented. So if you're in Chicago, you'll see whatever show is on there being advertised there, but we kind of colonized that space.
The song that Emily was playing for you at the beginning of the talk comes from this piece, which is called the Narcissism Chamber, and it's a live video feed or a video mirror. So as you sit inside this little area, you watch yourself listening to that song. Which made a lot of people profoundly uncomfortable, including the British ambassador to the United States of America.
Who came to see our show at the Cultural Center.
And here, of course, a career diplomat, he's humbly looking down rather than at himself.
This is still one of my favorite pieces because it creates such a complicated loop. And its origins were, I want to talk about its origins.
Well, a musician asked us years ago whether we wanted a theme song. Who's going to say no to that? Everyone wants a theme song. So we said, yeah, and then she went away and came back with this sort of wispy, atmospheric, you know. We just looked at each other and had no idea what that was. So, relatively diplomatically, I think, we were like,
yeah,
we can't use it. But, and so she's got a bit frustrated with that, and understandably, and she said, well, maybe you could supply some lyrics. And I just happened to have been reading the clinical definition of narcissism. So we sent her those lyrics, which returned into the song. He's listening to that song right there, the ambassador. But I don't think that version came anywhere close to how beautiful that version was.
So thanks, Emily, again for reinterpreting it for us.
So what we wanted to do was make a bust sculpture of Obama. And
as one does.
As one does, right? Who has not considered that a possibility? For a long time, it was well, we got the idea when he was first elected, and we managed to do it 4 years later on the eve of his re-election. So that worked out quite well. Partly the reason was it was a very expensive piece because we had to hire a butter sculptor, and they're not thick on the ground in the Midwest. So we hired the guy, where Ohio State Fair?
Yes.
The Ohio State Fair butter sculptor, who's apparently the best. And we had to fly him in from Cincinnati, and then we put him up in this meat packing district. So he was in this sort of temperature-controlled environment, surrounded by, the bodies of animals for 3 days, sculpting Obama. And we had a violinist who played patriotic tunes. I should say that the butter sculptor was very concerned because he said that he voted for Obama and he quite liked Obama, so he thought that this was a very negative, or potentially a negative piece. Were we making fun of Obama? I said, absolutely not. It's neither pro nor anti-Obama. It is just about this historical moment in American history, right? So we didn't show our hand in this. But there were also other people who thought that we were basically giving free advertising to Obama in the lead up to the election. So at about 6 o'clock in the morning, I was getting phone calls from these talk shows where they just talk to each other about politics, and then I don't listen to this kind of stuff, but they were calling me. I don't know why they were calling me. You were driving. I'm brushing my teeth, and this guy's like, where'd you get the money from? That was the angle that they were trying to get me on, right? Is this public funding? And if it's public funding, then it should be illegal. So we pushed him for about, 3 miles, 2 miles, pushed him, pulled him. We had to build this whole apparatus to keep him cool. And hang on. So every time we got past a bar, we would go into the bar and plug the president in, and he would cool down a little bit, and then we'd warm up the violinist, and then continue on our way. One interesting detail which we were unaware of at the time is that butter sculptors tend to work with unsalted butter, and salt is, of course, the preservative. So by definition, if you're making a butter sculpture, it's not going to preserve.
So after about a month of having placed this in the midst of our show at the Cultural Centre, we noticed that there were these blooms starting to appear on the surface of the president. And after several more months, it became so pronounced.
We actually had this object in our studio for like 2 years. And then, I don't know, we were doing a video conference with someone, weren't we?
Yeah.
Was it probably one of you?
Yeah, it's probably Cynthia.
and so that we could hear what we were talking about, we unplugged this thing and forgot to plug it back in. And in the morning when we went in, he had cleaved in two like that. It was actually quite emotional.
One of the guards who we got to know really well at the Cultural Centre was convinced that because Obama has mixed blood, that finally his African American or African blood was coming out, and he said, "This is so great. I feel like you have made the truest portrait of the president ever."
He's our biggest fan. You want to talk about this?
Yeah, we can go on.
So last year we did a performance where we called History and Forgetting, and we wanted to construct the largest ice flag, American ice flag that we could. So this thing was about 30 feet by about 20 feet, made of ice, and installed on a factory floor so that it would melt away, and in its melting carry away the DNA of the many thousands of workers that had preceded it into that space. So at dawn in the morning, we bookmarked. This was a very long performance. It took us nearly all day. Walking from Morro Bay was a breeze compared to what we went through to do this. But anyway, at dawn, we had this guy fly. We are not responsible across Chicago for an hour. And then we did the performance, and then in the evening, we got the guy flew. We are not responsible across Chicago.
No, we are responsible.
We are, we're not.
We are not in the morning, we are responsible. So this is at dusk.
There you go.
And as well as all of this, we collaborated with a longtime collaborator, Katinka Klein, who's the principal cellist for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and she played her favorite Bruckner symphonies for 3 hours as we constructed this flag out of ice. So you have a sense of it here after it was complete. And obviously it melted away overnight.
And we recorded on video that melting process with a 3D video camera, so in just a couple of minutes you can see the entire flag disappear.
The other aspect of this project, because it was actually part of the Year of Public Art for the City of Chicago, was that we interviewed a number of people who had grown up and lived in this neighborhood on the west side of Chicago. And so as Katinka was playing, as we were constructing this flag, there was a video scroll going through the whole space that made visible the words of all of these individuals that we'd interviewed about the life and history of the 37th Ward in Chicago. And so if you go to our website, you can actually hear all of those interviews. It's about half an hour long.
This is something we did in May. This is called Lachrymose, which means to cry. And we created a star map, 100 stars placed on the grid of Daly Plaza, which is right in the middle of the loop. And on a surprisingly hot day, given the time of year, it was May 1st, we waited with the ice to melt, or to put it another way, cry. The piece was also accompanied by Katinka,
who improvised on the spot a work that was based upon Mozart's Requiem, but highly individualized to her own interests. And you can see she's sitting at the foot of the Picasso sculpture, which you see partially there, and fully here. So this is after the melting has gone on for some time. Katinka has left, and we're actually, the piece changed tremendously over the course of the couple of hours that it took to make it, because what we weren't reckoning on was the fact that many people either unintentionally or in some cases intentionally started booting these stars across Daly Plaza. And so for the last 45 minutes of the piece, we essentially spent repositioning these. One guy, obviously with premeditated malice, booted one of these stars all the way across into the fountain at the other side of the plaza, which Matt went over and retrieved and replaced in its position.
Yeah, I was wading around in this fountain looking for a piece of ice in water. Quite the most ridiculous spectacle.
That may be it. It is. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Can you share a little bit about the Jesus piece and the T-shirts and the billboard and the history of that piece?
So this is one of the pieces that was a failure, at least at first. Jesus, who you saw booting Matt's head across the forecourt of the MCA, he was a former student of both of ours, and we decided over a long period of time that we wanted to make a piece with him, and we were interested in the fact that so many people of Latino origin are called Jesus, and the fact that at this point in time in our country, people whose name is Jesus are not exactly being welcomed with open arms, but particularly by people who consider that Jesus is their Lord and Savior. So we were interested initially in photographing all of the Jesuses that live in Chicago, which we estimated to be about 10,000, and we did probably for the only time a crowdfunding campaign to be able to pay Jesus to be the point person and go and find Jesuses and ask them if they would be willing to be photographed. For a number of reasons, this proved to be a much more complicated and difficult proposition, not least of which was that many of these Jesuses were undocumented, and so you can imagine the problems that would bring up. Also, our Jesus had some probably justified misgivings about the project, and so having worked on it for a year, we suspended it, and it was one of the projects that never came to fruition. But we have always been interested in the graphic that we made for this, which we feel still talks about many of the strange contradictions that still exist between those two seemingly identical names separated by one accent. And so, as part of this show, but not until November, there will be a billboard at the south end of San Luis Obispo with a very large version of that juxtaposition of Jesus and Jesus for 4 weeks. So we invite all of you who see it to photograph it and put it up on social media and hashtag Jesus. Any other questions? Yeah.
This is great. Thank you very much. It's great to have you guys here. I'm curious about, you mentioned crowdfunding.
Mm-hmm.
How do you fund the airplane, the ice banner, and all of that?
So, as I mentioned, that project was part of the City of Chicago's Year of Public Art, and so each ward have what is called menu funding. Yeah, my wife Cindy knows all about the inner workings of Chicago politics. So they each ward had a certain amount of money, and they could determine how much they were going to devote to this. And so the 37th ward alderwoman had enough money to be able to underwrite that project. And so we knew how much money was available, and so we essentially tailored the budget and the expanse of the project to the amount of money that we knew was available. And we get grants, and we work with institutions of all kinds, because we don't have that much work that we sell, so we've had to be pretty creative in finding ways to underwrite these projects, but because we've been doing it for a long time, people are willing to support us in that way. Anything else? Yeah.
So how did you guys get together?
All right, I'll handle this one.
Tell the truth.
I always tell the truth. So, when I first arrived in Chicago, just because I'm English, I guess, somebody said to me, "Oh, you should meet," and I'd heard Adam Brooks, you should know Adam Brooks, you know, right? So we had a mutual friend, and it was his show, and I went to this show, and this was the first time I'd ever seen him. So I walked up to him, and I was a graduate student, and I said, I'd really, you know, I'd really like to talk to you about my work. And he turned around to me, and he looked at me, and then down to my feet, and then back up, and I was traumatized.
I have no memory of
He has
this.
no memory of this, right? None of the bad stuff. So I'm like, well, I'm not talking to that guy. And a couple of years later, we were at a party, and the beer ran out. And it was actually the same guy that introduced us all those years before, or his show. And so he had a whip round. Everybody threw in $10 and said, can somebody go to the liquor store? So I volunteered, and he volunteered, and we took all of the money and went round the corner to a bar. And we were in there for about 6 hours. So around midnight, we went back to Max's house, and all his guests had left because there was no beer. And
He was furious.
It didn't help that I thought it was so funny. But eventually, none of that caused us to work together. We started working together. I had been involved in a collaborative similar project with somebody else that lasted 10 years. That ended, and so I called Adam, who was by that point teaching at Columbia College, where I was at the time as well, and so that's how it started.
Well, in the interest of time, I'm sure.
Oh, Emma, yes, you need to make an announcement.
If you have other questions, I encourage you to go back to the gallery, and they're really tired, so let them sit down, but when they're sitting, you can ask them all your questions. I want to say that this afternoon, after a long time of waiting, this year's brochures are here, so please take a stack with you. It has all the events we have coming up this year. The next one actually during this show, is a performance night on the 25th. That's going to be really great, so please come to that. All the details are in here. As you all know, our program is generously supported by the Harold J. Miosi Trust. We couldn't do anything that we do without that support, so big thanks to the Miosi Trust. And then we also often get additional sponsorships for exhibitions, and this exhibition is sponsored by Wells Fargo, so big thanks to both of those.